Let's bring back senior advisor for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, retired Colonel Mark Cancian, and former investigative correspondent for NPR and author of the Counteroffensive Substack Tim Mak, and David Rohde is also back with us. Okay, David, these tit-for-tat strikes on the energy facilities in the region, in Iran, as well as Qatar. We saw Brent crude futures rise to $119 a barrel after that. Can you describe or help us understand how pertinent these areas are?
This is a worst-case scenario, and this is the danger of launching a war in what is the center of the world's oil production. There's been changes in energy over the years, but still oil drives everything like this. These attacks drove prices up in Europe, their natural gas prices up by 30% this morning. Natural gas, Europe uses a lot of natural gas, so that's a huge impact economically. And once you start hitting these facilities, one of the things hit was a natural gas processing plant. That stops the production of it. And what's happening also is as oil shipments aren't made, Saudi Arabia is actually decreasing the amount of oil it's pumping because it has no place to put this oil. So the problem is if this continues, it could sort of back up the whole system and cause price rises and shortages for weeks. And just back to the testimony we were talking about from from Director Gabbard about planning for this. She was asked about, was there an assessment about what would happen in the Strait of Hormuz? And she's like, well, I think it was the Department of Commerce. And then she settled on it was the Department of Energy that did an assessment. She's the Director of National Intelligence. This is an incredibly important question. It's been warned about for decades. And it's just surprising to hear that kind of answer from her. It would be under her purview, one would think. President Trump posted on social media that the U.S. was unaware of Israel's plans to attack that South Pars field. Secretary Hegseth said today, quote, we hold the cards. But then he went on to say, quote, we have allies pursuing objectives as well. Meanwhile, multiple outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, say that the U.S. was informed of these strikes and had no issues with it, according to American and Israeli officials. MS Now has not independently verified the journal's reporting. What do you make of the lack of clarity on this attack? Would you be surprised if the U.S. essentially approved of this attack?
The United States almost certainly knew about the attack. The two air forces are working very closely, and they need to avoid fratricide and interfering with each other. So the United States certainly knew that the Israelis were going to do that. Whether they had time to react, whether they saw this and decided not to react, that's not clear. This was a tit for tat, and I'm sure the Israelis made the argument that, if they're going to strike the Gulf refineries and oil facilities, then we've got to do something in response. The United States might have accepted that.
Tim, President Trump also wrote, quote, no more attacks will be made by Israel, but adding, should Iran respond, the U.S. will, quote, blow up the field. How much of an escalation are these attacks on this site for the region?
Well, it's an incredible escalation. As we've mentioned, the price of crude oil has now skyrocketed above $115 per barrel. We're seeing at the pumps gas prices increasing 80+% over the course of just a couple weeks. And, one thing I want to point attention to is not just the effects of what is happening in the Middle East or even just for consumers in the United States, but what a huge boon this has been to the Russian government. The Russian governmental budget is 25% to 30% based on oil and gas revenues. And so this skyrocketing, immense price increase in the price of oil is creating a sudden windfall for the Russian military, which it can then use to fund its war in Ukraine.
Colonel Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent just talked about potentially unsanctioning Iranian oil. Listen.
In the coming days, we may unsanction the Iranian oil that's on the water. It's about 140 million barrels. So depending on how you count it, that's 10 days to 2 weeks of supply that the Iranians had been pushing out. That would have all gone to China. In essence, we will be using the Iranian barrels against the Iranians to keep the price down for the next 10 or 14 days as we continue this campaign.
Colonel, what do you make of that logic?
Well, the Iranians have been shipping their oil because they control the Straits of Hormuz. They decide who goes through. They're letting their own tankers through and some Turkish ships and whatnot. I think the administration is desperate to find ways to keep the price of gas down, so they're willing to even allow the Russians to export and the Iranians to export in order to feed the world hunger for oil and keep those prices down.
Tim, the foreign ministers of 12 Arab and Islamic countries are now calling on Iran to stop strikes on its neighbors. Saudi Arabia says what little trust there was before has completely been shattered. Is Iran digging itself into a hole with its neighbors it will not be able to climb out of?
Well, this is why Iran has indicated to its neighbors, hey, if you do not support the United States and Israel in its military operations, we will stop any sort of attacks against you. But what we've seen is a massive escalation by the Iranians to many attacking using Shahed drones and other projectiles to attack their neighbors, many of which have not been involved directly in the military campaign. They're realizing that that's not a great strategic move. However, there are big questions about who is in charge of the Iranian government and whether they can even make these kinds of strategic assurances, given how decentralized the military has become, in part because of how degraded they've been by the success of the American strategic campaign. Now, this all comes back to the price of oil, which, as it increases, analysts around the world, the buyers and sellers of oil, are starting to price in a long-term gap between supply and demand. And that is going to lead to elevated oil prices in the medium term. What people are really looking for in the markets is stability. When will this conflict end? When will the normal provision of energy resume, if it will resume at all?
Yeah, and no end in sight. We're seeing more escalation and even reporting now that there could be a $200 billion additional request in funding coming from the Pentagon to Congress. We'll keep an eye on that. David Rohde, Tim Mak, Colonel Mark Cancian, thank you all so much.